Did you know that a single detail of Tudor fashion can help us date a portrait of a Tudor woman with surprising accuracy, and it's hiding in plain sight in all these images? In this video from History Calling, I use original drawings and paintings to reveal the evolution of Tudor women's hoods from the time of Elizabeth of York to Elizabeth I, and teach you how to use these ladies' fashion choices as a simple yet powerful dating tool for their portraits. The story of hood wearing at the English court begins in the reign of Henry VII. Prior to that, as we can see in this picture of his mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, elite women's headdresses were more often in the form of large and cumbersome hats with huge veils, for lack of a better description, very different to what would follow. Starting with pictures of Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and his wife, Elizabeth of York, however, we begin to see the emergence of a very different style of headwear, the English gable hood, so called because it came to a point at the top above the head like the gable end of a house. The decorative band of jewels around the front of the hood, which isn't always present, is known as the billiment, while the long pieces of fabric coming down either side of the wearer's face are the lappets. Margaret wears a very simple style of the hood, similar to a nun's wimple. Elizabeth, however, has a billiment plus more jewels and embroidery on the lappets. There was also a veil at the back covering the hair, and always black, at least in every portrait I've ever seen. Between them, they show us the state of English hoods in the early 1500s, and both wear a version of this hood in their funerary monuments in Westminster Abbey, which is helpful to see because the portraits we have of them are posthumous copies of lost originals, while the funerary monuments were created not too long after their deaths, Elizabeth in 1503 and Margaret in 1509, and reassure us that the portraits are showing accurate fashion for the first decade of the 16th century. Going forwards as much as possible, I will try to stick to pictures for which we know the date of creation or very close to it, so that we can be sure we're seeing the true evolution of the hood at the English court and not something retroactively applied by later artists. Of course, women could also wear old hoods that they'd owned for years, but we might assume they were seeking to show off their best clothing in portraits and look fashionable. So while hood analysis is not an exact science when it comes to dating images, it allows us to narrow down the time frame in which a portrait was created very considerably, and at a minimum tells us the earliest year a picture can date from, as no one could wear a hood style that hadn't been invented yet. The speed with which the hood evolved is what makes it so useful for dating Tudor portraits. Unlike dresses, which changed very gradually over the course of decades, hoods were small enough and, comparatively speaking, cheap enough that their style could change much more quickly. Think of them as the fast fashion of the Tudor period. Thus, we only need to move forward a few years into the reign of Henry VIII to see his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, wearing a gable hood in around 1520, which is already very different to what her mother-in-law would have donned. The most notable change is the billiments. Just as with her mother-in-law, Queen Catherine has some beautiful and expensive decoration on them. However, they are much shorter and do not sit below shoulder level, but rather finish just above it. They are also more structured, so that they bend in towards the face slightly, rather than appearing to just fall from forehead height, as Elizabeth's did. We can see that the hood is a lot bulkier on the sides too, with what used to be two long flaps of lappet, one on either side, now folded back on themselves to double up the fabric over the ears. I do wonder if these hoods affected one's hearing, by the way. We are fortunate that we can trace the continuing development of the hood through a series of drawings and paintings of the women of the Tudor court undertaken by Hans Holbein the Younger during his 2 visits to England. He resided there between 1526 and 1528, and again between 1531 or 1532 and his death in London in 1543. During his initial visit, the drawings he made were done on white paper. During his second, he made them on slightly pink paper. These date ranges and paper choices help us to give rough dates to his drawings through which we can chart the changing nature of the English gable hood. It is worth noting, though, that the labels on them tend to be much later 18th century editions, so we can't use those to date the images by saying, this picture must date to before or after this year based on when we know this woman was married and what her title is in the caption. Also, some labels have been proven to be incorrect. We can see in this portrait of Mary Wotton Lady Guildford, copied from a 1527 original by Holbein, for which the preparatory drawing survives, that the hood was continuing to evolve, with one of the most noticeable changes being the flick out and away from the face that we can see at the base of the fabric which is supporting the billiments. We see this again on the hoods of several members of the family of Sir Thomas More, drawn then painted in 1526-27. This is a later copy as the original painting was lost to fire in the 18th century, but the hood style matches what we see in a surviving preparatory drawing. It also appears in another well-known portrait pattern of Catherine of Aragon, which exists in numerous examples and which the National Portrait Gallery dates to around 1530. As Catherine's time as queen gave way to that of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, the gable hood continued to evolve in style. In the only confirmed contemporary image we have of Anne, which is a portrait medal created in 1534, we see her wearing an English hood with flicked out billiment fabric which finishes just at or below her chin, and her veil pinned up in a much more elaborate fashion than anything we've seen so far, so that we see it form a triangular shape on her right, or left, while the rest of the material flows down her back. This mode of wearing the veil continued for a few years. Looking at an image of Elizabeth Lady Vaux from circa 1535, we see another complicated veil, still with the material onto which the decorative band of jewels is sewn, ending in a distinctive flick at the bottom and finishing around chin level, which is noticeably shorter than what we saw on the slightly earlier portrait of Lady Guildford. Margaret Roper, painted in 1535 or 1536 when she was 30 years old, Lady Ratcliffe, we're not sure which Lady Ratcliffe she was as there are several options, drawn in around 1536, and Frances Countess of Surrey, drawn in 1535-36, also have the elaborate veil and flick, but look at where the jewelled billiment bands are finishing. They are getting higher and higher, now ending closer to lip level, especially on Lady Ratcliffe. Moving forward to 1536 or 1537, we see another famous English gable hood on the head of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, in a portrait of her by Hans Holbein. The veil is still pinned up on top of the head, the billiments continue to flick out and rise up the face, and of course, as the Queen, Jane has some beautiful decoration around them. In fact, this decor, comprising sets of 4 pearls alternating with rubies set in gold quatrefoils, matches her necklace and the trim around her neckline, and is part of the famous Tudor Queen's Consort necklace, which Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard and Catherine Parr, and possibly Catherine of Aragon, wore in portraits too. I have a video about it, which I'll leave linked for you. There is other evidence that the ornate pinning of the hood was gradually going out of fashion as quickly as it had come in. This is the tomb of Catherine Lady Blunt and her husband. They were the parents of Bessie Blunt, who was one of Henry VIII's mistresses and mother of his son, the Duke of Richmond. Catherine died in 1540, and we see here that she is depicted in an English gable hood with the short billiments we expect by this era flicking out at the bottom, though there's some damage at the ends of these which makes the flick a little less obvious, but her veil is quite simply arranged. Perhaps this was because it was easier to carve, but this Holbein drawing of Mary Shelton, Lady Heveningham, cousin of Anne Boleyn, is dated circa 1543. And in it we see further indications that the crazy veil pinning seems to have passed. But the flick at the bottom of the billiments is still present. This hood is far less ornate than others we have seen though, suggesting Mary either had simpler tastes or wasn't as well off. There is only one image I've come across which might indicate an ornately pinned hood, but which doesn't fit in with the date range for that style that I've argued for so far, and that is a 1526 or 1527 drawing of Thomas More's daughter Elizabeth More, afterwards Dauncey, which was later mislabelled as Lady Berkeley. Her hood is quite odd looking compared to others. I can't tell if I'm looking at a veil pinned up to form a point extending out from the top of her head straight forwards, or if this is just an extra piece of material attached to the hood, which doesn't otherwise seem to have a veil, or at least we can't see one in this profile view. If it was pinned in the way that we see in later images though, we should be able to see more of the veil, I think, so I'm inclined to doubt that this is an early variation of the style that the likes of Anne Boleyn and Lady Surrey would later favour, but without being able to see more of her head, I really can't explain what's going on here. So let's see now if we can apply our new knowledge to provisionally date a few undated images. Assuming the label is correct, this is Catherine Willoughby Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk, final wife of Charles Brandon, Henry VIII's great friend and former brother-in-law. More on that in a minute. The drawing is by Holbein, and the Royal Collection Trust, which owns it, wonders if it might date to 1541 because that's when miniatures of Catherine's sons by Charles were created. This seems like a good guess to me, even just based on the hood. The billiments are quite short, ending only just below her lip line, suggesting it dates to the mid-1530s onwards. Catherine only became Duchess of Suffolk in 1533, by the way, at the age of 14, and though it's hard to guess the age of people in portraits, she doesn't look younger than that to me. We also see the flick at the bottom, but the veil is not elaborately pinned, which would indeed accord with a date from the end of the 1530s or early 1540s. This image of Margaret Beaufort, Lady Elliot, has all the same features, and I would hazard to place it in the same time frame as a result, though the Royal Collection Trust puts it a couple of years earlier at circa 1535, but that's close enough that we won't argue it. Maybe Lady Elliot was just very fashion forward. Now, England didn't exist in a fashion vacuum, of course. It was influenced by the fashions of other countries, and so it's time to meet the French hood, which existed alongside the English for decades. The French hood came into fashion in the French court, as you might assume, in the early 16th century, but it was some time before it made the jump across the English Channel. Though both sported veils at the back to cover the hair, the French hood was otherwise very different to the English Gable style, and the two could never be confused with each other. The French version was formed from a roughly crescent-shaped piece of fabric, which curved around the head, ear to ear, and tilted upwards the further back it went. It too had decorative billiments, but it had two sets of them, the upper and lower billiments, with the lower being the one closer to the forehead. It was considered more risque because it didn't come nearly as far forward on the head as the Gable hood, and therefore exposed far more of the wearer's hair, nor did it lie down the side of the cheeks in the way that a Gable hood did. A cap would be worn underneath it next to the hair, and you can often see the decorative edge of this peeking out from the front of the hood. A portrait of Henry VIII's younger sister, Mary, Dowager Queen of France, and her second husband, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk — Mary was his wife before Catherine Willoughby — is often touted as a marriage portrait and dated to circa 1515. This is then used in turn as proof that French hoods had arrived in England by then. However, there is increasing evidence that the portrait actually dates to much later, like the 1530s, not least because the French hood seen on Mary's head in it is not the correct style for the mid-1510s. We'll get to why in a few minutes. A picture of her, believed to have been taken from life during her brief spell in France and published in April 1515, shows a different style. In fact, as far as I'm aware, we don't have any pictorial evidence of the French hood's arrival at Henry VIII's court until the 1520s, though it is unimaginable that Mary didn't bring some home with her in 1515, and apparently she even wore one at the wedding of her brother Arthur to Catherine of Aragon all the way back in 1501, but I haven't been able to track down the primary source for that. Like the Gable hood, the French hood went through a metamorphosis over its existence. The earlier versions, which we need to look at images from France to see, display a hood with the bottoms of the crescent section hugging the wearer's jawline and upper billiments which are so long we might call them lappets, and which flick out behind the wearer and sit between chin and shoulder level. As time went on, these flicked lappets shrank, as we see in a circa 1520 image of Queen Claude of France. One of the earliest images of a French hood on an English woman, or rather girl, is an image of Princess Mary, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, not to be confused with her aunt, who was also Princess Mary Tudor of England. This was painted to celebrate her engagement to her cousin, Emperor Charles V of Spain, and therefore dates to 1521 to 1525 when that engagement took place. From it, we can see that the flicked fabric is gone, but the hood still comes down to her chin, covers her ears, and displays the front portion of her hair. She also only has a billement of jewels on the front of the hood. The high point at the back looks to be golden fabric, but unjewelled. It is another Tudor queen, though, not either of the two Marys, who is most heavily associated with the French hood. We now come to the famous B-pattern portraits of Anne Boleyn, which have probably done more to make the French hood famous than I think any other picture in history has, and which are known as the B-patterns because of her B-pendant necklace. It is Anne, who had lived at the French court for about 7 years before returning to England. She'd even been a lady-in-waiting to Mary Tudor Brandon while Mary was Queen of France, who is often credited with popularising the hood in her homeland. Now, it is true that onlookers said that one would have taken her for a native French woman in terms of her style and manners, but the main reason she is so connected to the French hood is, of course, because of the B-pattern portraits. No version of this portrait dates to Anne's life, however. The National Portrait Gallery in London says it thinks it shows Anne during her queenship of 1533 to 1536, maybe because of the inscription, which says she is Henry's wife, but given that she wears a B for Boleyn, her maiden name, I'm not so sure. It could be a copy of a portrait made before her marriage, with the inscription added in to confirm the identity of the sitter and her later career. I therefore wouldn't go any further than to say that this represents the French hood in England somewhere between Anne's return to that country in late 1521 and her death in May 1536. That said, I think it's later than Princess Mary's portrait because of changes to the hood. The crescent section finishes at about Anne's lip level and therefore reveals more of the face than Mary's hood did, and it also shows more of her hair, as we can see more of her parting than we could with Mary. Before we move on from Anne, I'd like to add that for all she is associated with the French hood, she actually wore the English style at crucial times as well, including on that 1534 medal, probably created to celebrate the anticipated birth of a son to her and Henry, and at her execution on the 19th of May, 1536. In her case, we might therefore see how her decision to wear French or English was tied to her lived experiences, to her politics, and to what she was trying to communicate to her audience. The French hood was what she'd been used to since childhood. It made her stand out at the English court and look extra chic, and it represented her support for good Anglo-French relations. On the other hand, when she needed to emphasise her Englishness, a Gable hood was an easy and quick way to do that. And I would add that I imagine Gable hoods were warmer too, which might have been a consideration that women had in mind during the cold winter months in England. As one aged, the more modest hood would also hide one's grey hairs better. We are on much firmer ground with the development of the French hood by looking at Hans Holbein's painting of the family of Sir Thomas More, originally created in 1526 to 1527. Now, the original portrait has been lost, and we're looking at a copy made in 1593, with which the artist Roland Lockley took some liberties, adding in the family of More's grandson, for instance. However, we still have a lot of the individual preparatory drawings Holbein made, as well as the group preparatory drawing, and they show two really interesting French hoods. One is on the head of Cicely Heron, the recently married daughter of Thomas More. The other is worn by Anne Cressacre, his ward and the fiancée of his son John. What makes them so interesting is that they aren't as rounded as most other French hoods we see. They almost look like a hybrid between the English gable and French hoods. Instead of curving around the head in a smooth crescent, both reach a point, maybe an inch or two above the women's ears, which are hidden, then make a near right angle turn downwards along the side of the face, terminating at lip level in Cicely's case and just above it in Anne's. This more architectural design is what brings a gable hood to mind, yet there's no third point above the head, as we would see in a gable. Both hoods show off the front of the women's hair, and there are no flicked out lappets or billiments. They also seem to have chin straps to hold them in place, which is a detail which is otherwise about a decade ahead of its time. More on that in a little while. These might be the most interesting of all the hoods I looked at for this video, in fact, simply because they seem to me to represent an attempt to marry together French and English styles. This attempt was short-lived though, if other pictures are anything to go by. Before we move on, just a quick reminder that if you're enjoying this video, I'd be very, very grateful if you would please give it a like and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on if you haven't done so already. These actions are totally free, they let YouTube know you approve, and they really help to promote the video. You can also join my YouTube membership for extra perks, or find me over on Patreon, where I release even more bonuses, including early access to ad-free videos and extra podcasts. The link for that is below for you, as is a link to my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can get 2 complimentary downloads by signing up to my free mailing list. For those of you with Irish ancestry, you might also want to check out my book, Find Your Irish Ancestors Online, available from Amazon as an ebook and a paperback, and details are also below. As we head into the 1530s, a rounded and increasingly revealing French hood won out in the style battles, as we see it again and again on the heads of the women of the Tudor court. The portrait of Mary Tudor Brandon and her husband Charles has been posited by historian Rosalind Mearns to date from early in this decade, partly because Mary died in 1533 and partly because of the hood style, which, as I've mentioned, doesn't match the styles worn in the later 1510s, nor does it come far enough down the face or have the necessary squared shape to date to the 1520s. We see an even more rounded style in this image labelled M. Souche, with the lower billiment coming down to her lip line. Now, unfortunately, this is another one where we don't know for sure who the sitter is, as there were several Madame Souches, with a Z not an S, alive at around this time, and that M might just stand for mistress or madame. It's not necessarily her first initial. We also can't even be sure that the label is correct either. However, for our purposes, her identity doesn't really matter as much as the fact that her picture can be dated to somewhere between 1536, when the watermark on the paper it's drawn on came into use, and the artist's death 7 years later. There is a similarly round hood set very far back on the head in this Holbein drawing labelled Lady Parker. This hood is so far back, in fact, that I find it hard to believe it's covering the woman's ears. We can't be sure when this image was made, but the fact that it's on pink paper tells us that it's from Holbein's second trip, dating it to between 1531 and 1543. It is sometimes wrongly identified as Anne Boleyn's sister-in-law, Jane Parker Boleyn, Viscountess Rochford, but, assuming the label of Lady Parker is correct, it actually shows one of Jane's own sisters-in-law, Grace or Elizabeth Parker, who were married to her brother Henry. I have a video all about this image and why we can be sure it isn't Jane, which I'll leave linked below for you. What would make these drawings much more useful would be if they were side profiles, which enabled us to see if they had chin straps holding the hoods in place. It's really impossible to tell with Lady Parker, but I would hazard a guess that Mistress Souche didn't need one, based on how low her lower billiment comes, suggesting that there was enough material and therefore grip to keep the hood in place without a strap. The reason the absence or presence of a strap is so interesting is because by 1538 they were becoming a must-have. In that year, Elizabeth Lady Audley was drawn and painted in miniature by Holbein, with a hood so far back on the head that a chin strap had to be worn to stop it falling off entirely. This detail echoes what Cicely Heron and Anne Cressaker were doing back in the 1520s, though even without straps, their hoods looked a lot more secure than Lady Audley's does, and to me, their straps looked optional. Unlike Mistress Souche, Lady Audley has lower billiments ending at nose level and curving in, which is what makes me think her image is a little later than Souche's. The hood is also quite high by now, with the upper billiment sitting well above where Lady Audley's head would have stopped. This style continued for a few years, for we see it again in 1540 or 1541 in this miniature of what is widely believed to be Queen Catherine Howard. Her hood is also very far back on her head, exposing a great deal of her hair, and with a lower billiment which curves inwards to touch the edge of her face and stop at about nose level. She needed a chin strap too. We can see that the jewelled upper billiment extends down the back of her neck, however, unlike in earlier images of French hoods, barring some of the B-pattern portraits of Anne Boleyn, which hint at this, but we need to remember that none of those are contemporary, nor do we know at what stage of her life they are meant to be showing Anne. This style continued into the mid-1540s after Catherine's death. She was executed in February 1542. Here we see her stepdaughter, the future Mary I, in a portrait which very helpfully tells us that it was painted in 1544 when she was 28. She is wearing a scarlet-coloured French hood decorated with pearls and other gemstones, with a high upper billiment that extends down the back of her neck to finish just about on a line with her lips. The lower billiment curves into her face and ends about mid-nose level, and the edge of a chin strap is just visible on screen right. It wasn't a hideous faux pas to wear a hood that didn't require a chin strap, though. Women had options. Here is Mary's little sister, the future Elizabeth I, in circa 1546, aged about 13, wearing a beautiful red French hood trimmed with pearls, gold buttons, and other gemstones, which was able to stay on her head without such a contraption, though when you look at how far back on her head it is perched, I don't quite understand the physics of it. Maybe there were combs or hairpins involved. We can also see that the upper billiment still extends down her neck, while the lower now finishes even higher up the face than those in earlier years would have done, only just covering her ears. We see a nearly identical style on her final stepmother, Catherine Parr, in a portrait dated to about 1545, and indeed in other pictures of Henry VIII's sixth queen. The French hood wasn't done evolving yet, though. During the reign of Mary I from 1553 to 1558, it was in vogue to have them be slightly squared in shape, not unlike what Cicely Heron and Anne Cressiger had worn nearly 30 years earlier, but without the sharp points and 90-degree angles. The Queen herself promoted this style, as we can see in portraits of her. She even eschewed a decorated lower billiment at times, having embellishments only around the upper one, and keeping her ears covered. Mary Neville, Baroness Dacre, wore the most extreme version of such a French hood I've found in a portrait of her and her son dating to 1559. The lower billiment now curved in and terminated at eyebrow level, with both upper and lower levels decorated with gold, pearls and gemstones. As the hood was paired with an early version of the famous Elizabethan ruff, we can't see if there was a chin strap holding it on. Lady Dacre notwithstanding, however, the hood's days were now numbered. As the Marian regime gave way to the Elizabethan, all types of hood gradually petered out. Early images of Queen Elizabeth after her ascension to the throne do not depict her wearing one, and in 1562 we see her maternal cousin, Catherine Knowles, wearing a white cap, though she is otherwise fully dressed. Hoods were still around though, and we can see Mary Fitzalan, Duchess of Norfolk, wearing one with a squared shape and a little ruff as late as 1565. I even found this outlier from 1579 showing Frances Lady Chandos with what looks like a small French hood and veil sitting far back on her head. I have to emphasise though that hoods like this were not normal by this point compared to the 1510s to 1550s, when you would almost never have seen a woman of the Tudor court without one when fully dressed, whether it was English or French. The reason I say almost is because there were some options for headwear other than these items. Henry VIII's daughter-in-law, Mary Howard, Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, wore a cap in her Holbein drawing dating to 1535 to 1536, and Queen Catherine Parr occasionally wore hats instead of hoods in the 1540s, though most of her portraits do show her in a French hood. The picture of Catherine of Aragon, by the way, dating to circa 1520, used to be believed to be Catherine Parr and was redated in part because the hood is so clearly all wrong for a woman who was queen in the 1540s and who was only around 8 years old in 1520. Nevertheless, despite the fact that options had existed in earlier decades, it was only in Elizabeth's reign that those options and new ones were widely adopted. For instance, as well as that black cap we saw on the Queen herself, We also have this image of an unknown but clearly very wealthy and fashionable young woman painted in 1567 wearing an ornate cap as well, and showing off one's hair, or one's wig, with beautiful jewels in it became increasingly popular. So let's sum up what we know, because there's been a lot of information in this video. If you're looking at an English-style gable hood, then the longer the lappets or billiments, the older the image. Very long lappets, not pinned up over the ears, indicate a date in the 1500s or 1510s. Billiments between the chin and shoulders without a flick at the end suggest early to mid-1520s. Billiments between the chin and shoulders with a flick and the veil just hanging down the back suggest mid-1520s to very early 1530s. Billiments down the chin with a flick and an elaborate veil belong to roughly the early to mid-1530s, as we saw that on Anne Boleyn's 1534 medal. As the billiments go up the face, we're getting later, into the mid to late 1530s onwards. And when you've got both high billiments and a less complicated veil, you've reached the late 1530s to the early 1540s. By that stage, though, we see less and less of the English hood and more of the French. For these, again, the more conservative they are, with billiments terminating low on the face and most of the hair covered up, the earlier the hoods are likely to be. Rounded hoods finishing near the chin suggest the 1510s and early 1520s. A squared shape with 2 points on either side suggests the mid to late 1520s, while a rounder shape with billiments ending at lip level and higher was increasingly in vogue in the 1530s. Once you see a rounded hood showing so much hair that a chin strap is needed to hold it in place and upper billiments run down the neck, you're into the late 1530s to mid-1540s. Squared hoods, but not quite as pointed as in the 1520s, indicate you're looking at the 1550s or 1560s. If a hood appears alongside a dress sporting a ruff, you're at the latter end of that time frame, almost certainly in the Elizabethan era. And voila, gang, now you know how to roughly date Tudor portraits of women in the first half of the 16th century based on their hoods. I bet going forwards, you're never going to look at such portraits the same way again. You'll always have one eye on their hoods now and be thinking 1510s, 1520s, 1530s, 1540s and beyond. I hope you enjoyed the video and found that little tutorial on portrait dating interesting and useful. Let me know in the comments which style of hood is your favourite. If you open up the description box below, you'll find links to other videos from me which discuss Tudor fashion, jewellery and art in more detail, or if you can't wait and just want to head straight into another episode, click one of the end cards to check out my videos on the Tudor consort necklace, the checkers ring and whether or not it shows a portrait of Anne Boleyn, or my episode on her famous bee necklace. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.